Saint Francis of Assisi, born Giovanni di Pietro di Bernardone, informally named as Francesco, 1181–1182 to 3 October 1226, was an Italian Roman Catholic friar and preacher. He founded the Men's Order of Friars Minor, the Women's Order of St. Clare, the Third Order of St. Francis and the Custody of the Holy Land. Francis is one of the most venerated religious figures in history. Pope Gregory IX canonized Francis on 16 July 1228. Along with Saint Catherine of Siena, he was designated patron saint of Italy. He later became associated with patronage of animals and natural environment, which became customary for Catholic and Anglican churches to hold ceremonies blessing animals on his feast day of October 4. Francis is also known for his love of the Eucharist, while also bearing the wounds of stigmata, the apparition of seraphic angels during his religious ecstasy, and for the creation of the live Christmas nativity scene. Early life. Francis of Assisi was one of 7 children born in late 1181 or early 1182 to Pietro and his wife Pica de Borlemont, about whom little is known except that she was a noblewoman originally from Provence. Pietro was in France on business when Francis was born in Assisi, and Pica had him baptized as Giovanni. When his father returned to Assisi, he took to calling him Francesco, possibly in honor of his commercial success and enthusiasm for all things French. Since the child was renamed in infancy, the change can hardly have had anything to do with his aptitude for learning French, as some have thought. As a youth, Francesco became a devotee of troubadours and was fascinated with all things transalpine. Although many hagiographers remark about his bright clothing, rich friends, and love of pleasures, his displays of disillusionment toward the world that surrounded him came fairly early in his life. As is shown in the story of the beggar, in this account, he was selling cloth and velvet in the marketplace on behalf of his father when a beggar came to him and asked for alms. At the conclusion of his business deal, Francis abandoned his wares and ran after the beggar. When he found him, Francis gave the man everything he had in his pockets. His friends quickly chided and mocked him for his act of charity. When he got home, his father scolded him in rage. In 1201, he joined a military expedition against Perugia and was taken as a prisoner at Collestrada, spending a year as a captive. It is possible that his spiritual conversion was a gradual process rooted in this experience. Upon his return to Assisi in 1203, Francis returned to his carefree life. In 1204, a serious illness led him to a spiritual crisis. In 1205, Francis left for Apulia to enlist in the army of Walter III, Count of Brienne. A strange vision made him return to Assisi, deepening his ecclesiastical awakening. According to the hagiographic legend, thereafter he began to avoid the sports and the feasts of his former companions. In response, they asked him laughingly whether he was thinking of marrying, to which he answered, "Yes. A fairer bride than any of you have ever seen," meaning his Lady Poverty. He spent much time in lonely places, asking God for enlightenment. By degrees he took to nursing lepers, the most repulsive victims in the lazar houses near Assisi. After a pilgrimage to Rome, where he joined the poor in begging at the doors of the churches, he said he had a mystical vision of Jesus Christ in the country chapel of San Damiano, just outside of Assisi, in which the icon of Christ crucified said to him, "Francis, Francis, go and repair my house which, as you can see, is falling into ruins." He took this to mean the ruined church in which he was presently praying, and so he sold some cloth from his father's store to assist the priest there for this purpose. Francis's father was Pietro di Bernardone, a prosperous silk merchant. Francis lived the high-spirited life typical of a wealthy young man, even fighting as a soldier for Assisi. While going off to war in 1204, Francis had a vision that directed him back to Assisi, where he lost his taste for his worldly life. On a pilgrimage to Rome, he joined the poor in begging at St. Peter's Basilica. The experience moved him to live in poverty. Francis returned home, began preaching on the streets, and soon gathered followers. His order was authorized by Pope Innocent III in 1210. He then founded the Order of Pauclares, which became an enclosed religious order for women, as well as the Order of Brothers and Sisters of Penance. In 1219, he went to Egypt in an attempt to convert the Sultan to put an end to the conflict of the Crusades. By this point, the Franciscan order had grown to such an extent that its primitive organizational structure was no longer sufficient. He returned to Italy to organize the order. Once his community was authorized by the Pope, he withdrew increasingly from external affairs. In 1223, Francis arranged for the first Christmas nativity scene. In 1224, he received the stigmata, making him the first recorded person to bear the wounds of Christ's Passion. He died during the evening hours of October 3, 1226, while listening to a reading he had requested of Psalm chapter 142. His father, Pietro, highly indignant, attempted to change his mind, first with threats and then with beatings. In the midst of legal proceedings before the Bishop of Assisi, Francis renounced his father and his patrimony, laying aside even the garments he had received from him in front of the public. For the next couple of months he lived as a beggar in the region of Assisi. Returning to the countryside around the town for 2 years, he embraced the life of a penitent, during which he restored several ruined chapels in the countryside around Assisi, among them the Porziuncula, the little chapel of St. Mary of the Angels just outside the town, which later became his favorite abode. Founding of the Franciscan orders. The Friars Minor. At the end of this period, Francis heard a sermon that changed his life forever. The sermon was about Matthew chapter 10 verse 9, in which Christ tells his followers they should go forth and proclaim that the kingdom of heaven was upon them, that they should take no money with them, nor even a walking stick or shoes for the road. Francis was inspired to devote himself to a life of poverty, clad in a rough garment, barefoot, and, after the gospel precept, without staff or scrip, he began to preach repentance. He was soon joined by his first follower, a prominent fellow townsman, the jurist Bernardo di Quintival, who contributed all that he had to the work. Within a year Francis had 11 followers. Francis chose never to be ordained a priest, and the community lived as lesser brothers, fratres minores in Latin. The brothers lived a simple life in the deserted lazar house of River Torta near Assisi, but they spent much of their time wandering through the mountainous districts of Umbria, always cheerful and full of songs, yet making a deep impression upon their hearers by their earnest exhortations. Francis's preaching to ordinary people was unusual since he had no license to do so. In 1209 he composed a simple rule for his followers, the Regula Primitiva or primitive rule, which came from verses in the Bible. The rule was to follow the teachings of our Lord Jesus Christ and to walk in his footsteps. In 1209, Francis led his first 11 followers to Rome to seek permission from Pope Innocent III to found a new religious order. Upon entry to Rome, the brothers encountered Bishop Guido of Assisi, who had in his company Giovanni di San Paolo, the Cardinal Bishop of Sabina. The cardinal, who was the confessor of Pope Innocent III, was immediately sympathetic to Francis and agreed to represent Francis to the Pope. Reluctantly, Pope Innocent agreed to meet with Francis and the brothers the next day. After several days, the Pope agreed to admit the group informally, adding that when God increased the group in grace and number, they could return for an official admittance. The group was tonsured. This was important in part because it recognized church authority and prevented his following from possible accusations of heresy, as had happened to the Waldensians decades earlier. Though Pope Innocent initially had his doubts, following a dream in which he saw Francis holding up the Basilica of St. John Lateran, he decided to endorse Francis's order. This occurred, according to tradition, on April 16, 1210, and constituted the official founding of the Franciscan order. The group, then the Lesser Brothers, preached on the streets and had no possessions. They were centered in the Porziuncula and preached first in Umbria, before expanding throughout Italy. The Poor Clares and the Third Order. From then on, the new order grew quickly with new vocations. Hearing Francis preaching in the Church of San Rufino in Assisi in 1211, the young noblewoman Clare of Assisi became deeply touched by his message and realized her calling. Her cousin Rufino, the only male member of the family in their generation, was also attracted to the new order. On the night of Palm Sunday, March 28, 1212, Clare clandestinely left her family's palace. Francis received her at the Porziuncula and thereby established the Order of Poor Ladies, later called Poor Clares. This was an order for women, and he gave Clare a religious habit, or garment, similar to his own, before lodging her and a few female companions in a nearby monastery of Benedictine nuns. Later he transferred them to San Damiano. There they were joined by many other women of Assisi. For those who could not leave their homes, he later formed the Third Order of Brothers and Sisters of Penance, a fraternity composed of either laity or clergy whose members neither withdrew from the world nor took religious vows. Instead, they observed the principles of Franciscan life in their daily lives. Before long, this Third Order grew beyond Italy. Travels. Determined to bring the gospel to all God's creatures, Francis sought on several occasions to take his message out of Italy. In the late spring of 1212, he set out for Jerusalem, but he was shipwrecked by a storm on the Dalmatian coast, forcing him to return to Italy. On May 8, 1213, he was given the use of the mountain of La Verna as a gift from Count Orlando di Chiusi, who described it as eminently suitable for whoever wishes to do penance in a place remote from mankind. The mountain would become one of his favorite retreats for prayer. In the same year, Francis sailed for Morocco, but this time an illness forced him to break off his journey in Spain. Back in Assisi, several noblemen and some well-educated men joined his order. In 1215, Francis went again to Rome for the Fourth Lateran Council. During this time, he probably met a canon, Dominic de Guzman. In 1217, he offered to go to France. Cardinal Ugolino of Segni, an early and important supporter of Francis, advised him against this and said that he was still needed in Italy. In 1219, accompanied by another friar and hoping to convert the Sultan of Egypt or win martyrdom in the attempt, Francis went to Egypt during the Fifth Crusade, where a Crusader army had been encamped for over a year besieging the walled city of Damietta 2 miles upstream from the mouth of one of the main channels of the Nile. The Sultan, Al-Kamil, a nephew of Saladin, had succeeded his father as Sultan of Egypt in 1218 and was encamped upstream of Damietta. Unable to relieve it, a bloody and futile attack on the city was launched by the Christians on August 29, 1219, following which both sides agreed to a ceasefire which lasted 4 weeks. It was most probably during this interlude that Francis and his companion crossed the Saracen lines and were brought before the Sultan, remaining in his camp for a few days. The visit is reported in contemporary Crusader sources and in the earliest biographies of Francis, but they give no information about what transpired during the encounter beyond noting that the Sultan received Francis graciously and that Francis preached to the Saracens without effect, returning unharmed to the Crusader camp. No contemporary Arab source mentions the visit. One detail, added by Bonaventure in the official life of Francis, has Francis offering to challenge the Sultan's priests to trial by fire in order to prove the veracity of the Christian gospel. Such an incident is alluded to in a scene in the late 13th century fresco cycle, attributed to Giotto, in the Upper Basilica at Assisi. It has been suggested that the winged figures atop the columns piercing the roof of the building on the left of the scene are not idols but a part of the secular iconography of the Sultan, affirming his worldly power which, as the scene demonstrates, is limited even as regards his own priests, who shun the challenge. Although Bonaventure asserts that the Sultan refused to permit the challenge, subsequent biographies went further, claiming that a fire was actually kindled which Francis unhesitatingly entered without suffering burns. The scene in the fresco adopts a position midway between the two extremes. According to some late sources, the Sultan gave Francis permission to visit the sacred places in the Holy Land and even to preach there. All that can safely be asserted is that Francis and his companion left the Crusader camp for Acre, from where they embarked for Italy in the latter half of 1220. Drawing on a 1267 sermon by Bonaventure. Later sources report that the Sultan secretly converted or accepted a deathbed baptism as a result of the encounter with Francis. The Franciscan order has been present in the Holy Land almost uninterruptedly since 1217 when Brother Elias arrived at Acre. It received concessions from the Mameluke Sultan in 1333 with regard to certain holy places in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and jurisdictional privileges from Pope Clement VI in 1342. Reorganization of the Franciscan order and death. By this time, the growing order of friars was divided into provinces and groups were sent to France, Germany, Hungary, and Spain and to the east. Upon receiving a report of the martyrdom of 5 brothers in Morocco, Francis returned to Italy via Venice. Cardinal Ugolino di Conti was then nominated by the Pope as the protector of the order. Another reason for Francis's return to Italy was that the friars in Italy were causing problems. The Franciscan order had grown at an unprecedented rate compared to prior religious orders, but its organizational sophistication had not kept up with this growth and had little more to govern it than Francis's example and simple rule. To address this problem, Francis prepared a new and more detailed rule, the First Rule, or Rule without a papal bull, which again asserted devotion to poverty and the apostolic life. However, it also introduced greater institutional structure, though this was never officially endorsed by the Pope. On September 29, 1220, Francis handed over the governance of the order to Brother Peter Catani at the Porziuncola, but Brother Peter died only 5 months later, on March 10, 1221, and was buried there. When numerous miracles were attributed to the deceased brother, people started to flock to the Porziuncola, disturbing the daily life of the Franciscans. Francis then prayed, asking Peter to stop the miracles and to obey in death as he had obeyed during his life. The reports of miracles ceased. Brother Peter was succeeded by Brother Elias as vicar of Francis. 2 years later, Francis modified the first rule, creating the Second Rule, or Rule with a Bull, which was approved by Pope Honorius III on November 29, 1223. As the official rule of the order, it called on the friars to observe the holy gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, living in obedience without anything of our own and in chastity. In addition, it set regulations for discipline, preaching, and entry into the order. Once the rule was endorsed by the Pope, Francis withdrew increasingly from external affairs. During 1221 and 1222, Francis crossed Italy, first as far south as Catania in Sicily and afterwards as far north as Bologna, while he was praying on the mountain of Verna, during a 40-day fast in preparation for Michaelmas. Francis is said to have had a vision on or about September 14, 1224, the feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, as a result of which he received the stigmata. Brother Leo, who had been with Francis at the time, left a clear and simple account of the event. The first definite account of the phenomenon of stigmata. Suddenly he saw a vision of a seraph, a 6-winged angel on a cross. This angel gave him the gift of the 5 wounds of Christ, suffering from these stigmata and from trachoma. Francis received care in several cities to no avail. In the end, he was brought back to a hut next to the Porziuncula. Here, in the place where it all began, feeling the end approaching, he spent the last days of his life dictating his spiritual testament. He died on the evening of Saturday, October 3, 1226, singing Psalm chapter 142, Voce mea ad Dominum. On July 16, 1228, he was pronounced a saint by Pope Gregory IX. The next day, the Pope laid the foundation stone for the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. Francis was buried on May 25, 1230, under the lower basilica, but his tomb was soon hidden on orders of Brother Elias to protect it from Saracen invaders. His exact burial place remained unknown until it was rediscovered in 1818. Pasquale Belli then constructed for the remains a crypt in neoclassical style in the lower basilica. It was refashioned between 1927 and 1930 into its present form by Ugo Tacchi, stripping the wall of its marble decorations. In 1978, the remains of St. Francis were examined and confirmed by a commission of scholars appointed by Pope Paul VI, and put into a glass urn in the ancient stone tomb.